Hello and welcome to this podcast webinar brought to you by ScultureAI. Slightly different to the ones we've done before. It's the first of a series where we're inviting leading business thinkers and researchers to discuss their latest research and its practical relevance to business leaders like the people who are listening in today. I hope what it will do is make it easy for you to stay up to date with cutting edge research and bring home to you the relevance of what you need to do today in the work that you do. And because a lot of our focus, as you know, is on HR leaders, we're also including in each session a case study where we bring in a transformational HR leader who's putting some of the ideas that we're going to be discussing into practice. I'm Andrew Rashbass. I'm the chair of ScultureAI and the former CEO of the Economist Group, the news agency Reuters, and the information company Euromoney. I'm delighted to be joined today by a giant of the business school world, Professor Raffaella Sadun. Raffaella is the Charles Edward Wilson Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School, is the school's lead on the project to manage the future of work and co-principal investigator of the Digital Reskilling Lab. Raffaella and I have known each other a very long time. We first met when Raffaella was teaching a case study that the school wrote on The Economist, which I'd been involved in the kind of underlying story. And then we stayed in touch. And then actually much more recently, when I was teaching first year MBA students at Harvard Business School, Raffaella was put in charge of supervising me. So sat in on my classes and gave me very trenchant, constructive, but lots of trenchant feedback, shall we say, on my teaching. So it was a kind of reversal. I'd sat in on her classes all those years ago, and then she sat in on mine. So, as I say, Raffaella is a giant in this world and is an amazing, as I think you're about to discover, an amazing thinker and researcher, and has turned a lot of her recent attention to AI, and in particular to generative AI. So, Raffaella, welcome. It's wonderful to have you here today.
Thank you, Andrew, and it's a pleasure to be with you. You know how much respect I have for you as a leader in the transformation of businesses. So it's my pleasure to be here. And I didn't want to be trenchant in my comments. I'm sorry if that's the case.
Well, I like trenchant. We'll have our conversation. I'm sure will be that today. So, Raffaella, I want to start with actually, hot off the press, really. In the current issue of Harvard Business Review, you and your collaborators write an amazing piece, I think, on the role of systematic experimentation in implementing generative AI. And I want to quote a line that you write in your paper. You say, quote, "Fast and rigorous experimentation is emerging as a strategic imperative in the Gen AI era." And I know how carefully you pick your words, so I know you won't have said that lightly. So can you describe the research, why it's important and relevant to business leaders like our audience today, and what your findings are?
Yeah, sure. So look, that article is basically a summary of what is happening here in my lab as well as in other labs at HBS, where we realized a couple of things. The first one is we are dealing with a technology that is still in a very early stage. Sometimes it feels like, oh my God, we do nothing but talking about AI, it must be mature. But in fact, the application of generative AI inside organizations is still at a very early stage. And it's a general purpose technology, which means, using the nerdy language of economics, that actually its value resides not so much in the technology alone, but in the complementarities, in the various ways in which this technology interacts with the organization, the systems, the processes, and the people. So if you combine, in a sense, we are at the very early stages of a new industrial revolution where the playbook does not exist. Despite, everything we hear and the amount of certainty, this is a time where learning and learning in a systematic way has tremendous value. Every organization is actually creating its own playbook. This is a technology that delivers value as long as it's really integrated with the ways in which the companies think about and deliver their own value. So if you combine all of this together, uncertainty, firm specificity, the need for learning, that I think leads you to saying, okay, what's the best way that you can actually learn? And the article makes the point, talking, in building on work that we're doing here, that this is a time for managers to become a little bit like scientists. And, going from, we know that there is a lot of appetite for pilots and experimentation, but somehow the word rigorous is there because we think that it's not just about piloting, which might lead to pilotitis, but it's about learning, which means understanding how does this technology what are your hypotheses for how the technology might add value to what you do? What are your processes to really understand whether your hypotheses are supported or not by the data? And how do you integrate these learnings in your iterations, in your next stages of technology deployment? And this is, what we try to explain in the article is that this seems like it should reside within the world of scientists, but in fact, we are seeing organizations really connecting with this way of thinking about experimentation and partnering, either doing it by themselves or partnering with academics to help acquire this capability. And that's really where I think there is a lot of promise.
It's fascinating. I mean, it's. I think one of the companies you work with was Procter & Gamble, and you did a very big study there. Can you talk about kind of their takeaways? How they felt about this process, and what some sort of specifics that they took away from it.
Yeah, I mean, and I should say Procter & Gamble, we keep working with them. So I think that they enjoyed it and they see value in that. But that specific experiment is the first one that we did together. And it came from, it's an experiment that is based in the R&D function. Came from the realization, from the idea that perhaps generative AI could help the R&D function in its innovation activities. So what was the hypothesis there is that, usually when you are in the early stages of innovation, you have marketing and R&D, they need to come together to the table and sort of work out at a very early stage what's promising or what's not. Now, this is for good reasons. You want these two expertise to come together, each one brings value. But as you can imagine, sometimes you wonder whether these early interactions might create also frictions and perhaps truncate good ideas too early in the process. So the hypothesis is, what if generative AI could serve as a teammate and therefore help you in these very early stages of innovation to sort of bounce ideas off and understand, and push the boundaries in a team composed by humans and AI rather than just humans. So that was the premise. We implemented it in a hackathon. So this was a fairly easy, way of doing it, where we had about 800 people, and the task was to come up with a new idea. It's, a lab in the field. That's how we call it. So you want to be careful about extrapolations, but we did it in a rigorous way. The teams were allocated in 4 groups randomly, and then we could really say something about the causal impact of having people working on their own, individuals working on their own versus individuals working with AI versus the usual teams of humans and teams of humans augmented by AI. That setup gave us the opportunity to say, this is what AI causally, what's the causal impact of AI in the creation of a new idea. And the findings were that, first of all, AI brought individuals to the same level of quality as human teams, but of course it did it at a much lower cost in terms of time. So there was some very encouraging signs of AI helping bridge expertise and silos of expertise that are usually the only way to do it is to have experts like humans interacting. In this case, there was a nice sort of suggestive evidence that AI could help these experts augment the skill set of this expert. And we see some evidence of this in the type of ideas that they propose as well. You see R&D people becoming a little bit more like marketing people, and marketing people becoming a little more like R&D people. Whether they wanted that or not, I don't know, but that's what we see in the data.
I think it's really interesting, and I was very struck by that when I read that and some of the other sort of supporting materials, that this breaking down of silos in a couple of ways. One, as you say, was that it actually, if you like, gave the benefit of getting some marketing expertise into R&D and vice versa without having to deal with the humans. But then the other side was it actually acted as a way to make the bridge between those humans stronger, or to create the bridge between the humans. And I hadn't really, and most people who think about Gen AI probably think about the first one, which is, okay, I don't need those humans anymore. But actually, I think I saw in your findings that actually there was this other side as well, that they actually worked better with their human colleagues in these other departments because of the Gen AI. Have I sort of caught that correctly?
You did, actually. I mean, that's true. And in fact, we see that teams of humans plus AI do especially well in delivering these exceptional ideas. Everything I was telling you about before was about the average quality of the idea. But then, of course, you know, if you are in this space, you care about the really, really innovative ideas. And that's where we see that teams of humans and AI do better. I think, Andrew, more generally, and the reason why I'm personally interested in this, I really like and I'm fascinated by the idea of generative AI being a way to democratize expertise, meaning taking expertise that usually is embodied in people, and therefore, you know, the limit to the use of that expertise is the time of the experts, and finding ways to make that expertise usable, available, and maybe even you know, to parts of the organization that would typically be very, very far from the experts.
And I've seen a research of yours, and which sort of looks at that issue and recognizes then, or finds that, if I understood it correctly, that the people who are most dispossessed by are not always the people you might expect. You know, one might, that actually this democratization, this leveling up within an organization actually creates some organizational dynamics that perhaps we haven't seen before. Do you think, is that consistent with your findings?
It's interesting. I think it's early stages to know. Sometimes, you know, I'm old enough and I'm making a confession that the first chapter in my dissertation, in my thesis, PhD thesis, was about the frictions in the adoption of ICT technologies. And you know, how it really is not just about the technology, but it's about the organizational response, and to a large extent, how you manage the technology adoption. And I am seeing, you know, that's like, I feel like flashbacks in many ways, like going back to, you know, the research from 20 years. What is different here? And what is, again, I think it touches on aspects of professional identity that perhaps ICT did not, is that now we are talking about potentially working, you know, not dispossessing, but bottling up the expertise, the knowledge of experts who have grown up in the organization as experts. And for good reasons, I think, we're expecting that knowledge to be exclusive to, you know, their great, their mind, which, I mean, everything in the world of the modern knowledge organization is organized around expertise. So it's completely plausible to have that mental model. Now I think we are moving to a place where the role of experts potentially might change, because part of what they know may be embodied in generative AI, and their role becomes, of course, they still provide their expertise, but you can see how it slightly changes. They maybe need to push the envelope and push the boundaries of expertise even more. Or maybe they need to be the managers of other experts that are now immediately becoming, potentially as knowledgeable, at least on the surface, as they are. So I think that those are the dynamics that we don't know yet much about. I can expect people being completely enthusiastic about this role, and I see it in some organizations. But I also see fear, and I see people who are not entirely convinced that that's how they want to spend their professional lives.
But I've also seen that because those experts in particular, who perhaps are a bit more senior, been at it a bit longer, and now being encouraged or forced to change, are do that reluctantly, shall we say. So even though you see this, perhaps this leveling up of the less skilled or the less expert because of the expertise they get from AI, you're not necessarily seeing those experts going and doing other things. And I saw somewhere about the need for, again, what should an organization do about that? You have to sometimes to change the kind of the incentives of those experts, what it is that they are recognized for and rewarded for. And I mean, you're an economist, and therefore incentives, play a big part, rather than kind of, I don't know, the overarching good of the company, or how should managers and leaders think about how incentives, and I'm not here talking about narrowly just about financial incentives, but generally the whole framework of incentives within an organization. How does this change the way an organization has to think about incentives?
I think that you point out the right thing. So should we think about incentives in a narrow way or in a broader way? And I personally think that there are monetary incentives and non-monetary incentives that have to do with culture, purpose, and something that is not necessarily task specific. Actually, it's more about why do we exist. And so I think it really starts from having a clear sense at the company level of why do we exist. So it's the strategy. You cannot talk about incentives if you don't really know what you want to incentivize, and that's where the strategy becomes super important. I'm a strategy professor, so I am biased that way. Now, when it comes to then execution of that strategy, incentives from a monetary standpoint can take you only up to a point, because to have a monetary incentive working, you have to have a contract that is fully specified and tells you all the contingencies that will trigger a reward. And so in these cases, especially when we're in a moment of uncertainty, change, and learning, I think that the relational contracts, the type of culture that we, and the behaviors that we push in the organization, can be extremely valuable. I'm reading a book called Identity Economics by George Akerlof and Rachel Crampton. Highly recommended. It's not technical at all, but it really makes this very important point that often organizations are, really shaped around culture and purpose, because that's one way to select the right type of people for your firm, but also to motivate them. And I think my hunch is that with generative AI, those are the type of incentives that you really want to think about.
It's fascinating, and I think when later on in the discussion we start talking about a case study after our discussion, I think that's a key part of what we're going to be discussing there. Is the way in which you can be much more scientific, perhaps, about the culture you need. But more importantly, how do you actually implement that? Because it seems, yes, you're saying, highlighting the importance of it, but then it seems such an intractable thing. It seems such a difficult thing to grasp and to shape. And therefore, how can you use some of the same technologies that we're talking about in this part of the discussion around culture? So that's something that I hope the audience will look forward to.
Oh my gosh, if you find a solution to that, we'll teach it immediately, right?
Absolutely. Well, we hope we have, and as I say, that's I'll fill you in offline on that one. And then one of the things that's interesting in some of the complexities that we're talking about is that it leads to this thing which is called, and you call it in your paper, I think, the J curve. It seems to be I think one of the things that is most useful, perhaps, is to let leaders see what they should expect. I mean, the J curve, is it inevitable? I mean, perhaps you could describe what the J curve is.
Yes.
And then lots of our listeners will be nodding their heads when you describe it, say yes, 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 and perhaps to describe the dynamic and how you come out of the dip.
The J-curve as therapy for managers. I like that.
Exactly.
Okay, good. So the J-curve is actually, something that is well known among the world of productivity, and especially, from a macroeconomic perspective. I think we've been talking about the J-curve for a long time. And again, it's connected to the idea that general purpose technologies require learning and adaptation to be productive. It took about 40 years for electricity to show up in the productivity statistics. It took 20 years for ICTs to show up in the macro productivity statistics. Why is that? Well, it's because when you come up with a new technology, you have to understand how do you organize and change the activities and the reward systems and the people that allow you to make that technology productive. For the case of electricity, there is a beautiful paper by Paul David, who was an economic historian at Stanford, who made the point that, when the electricity came up, people just took the steam engine out, plugged the electricity in. The plant was a little bit better, less noisy, but nothing really happened. Everything happened in terms of productivity when you had new people coming up and understanding that you needed to really change even how the machines were organized, how people were organized. So that's the idea of the J-curve. Now, at the macro level, we take the J-curve almost as an exogenous, fact of life. It's going to happen, and there's going to be a little bit of a decline in productivity early on in the story of in the adoption process. This is all the experimentation that is not necessarily productive initially, but then once you figure out, you're going to have an exponential increase in productivity. That's why it's called the J-curve. Now, if you translate the J-curve to managers, however, and the point that we make in that article that you were mentioning earlier, is that actually the J-curve is endogenous to your behavior and what you want to do. And so as a manager, you need to know that experimentation is going to be part of your life.
Just for our audience, do you want to explain the difference you're drawing between exogenous and endogenous, just in case people are not?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, yes, bring me back to earth. Yes, thank you. So exogenous is basically something that just happens. You cannot really do any. It happens, and it's not a function of managerial choices. Endogenous means that it's a consequence of decisions that are made by managers. In this specific context, that's how I'm using it. And so if you think about it, you as a manager, think about this J-curve. There is going to be one J-curve at the aggregate level, but in fact, every firm is on its own J-curve. And so you as a manager, you can effectively decide how shallow, how shallow will this J-curve be? How quickly will it go from negative to positive? And this is a function of what you do. And so I think that this gives agency to managers. It doesn't mean that there will not be a moment of a period of adaptation. Actually, I expect that companies will need to go through a period of experimentation and adaptation in any case. But if you structure yourself for learning systematically, rather than having to make the same mistake 100 times, you will quickly, move up and sort of incorporate that learning into your next stages.
It's very interesting. I mean, you talk about culture, and maybe there's a way of doing that scientifically that we'll come on to. You talk about the role of the manager in making those decisions. I think one of the things that's very interesting, and I think you draw it out in your some of your research, is the role of the middle manager. There's a great feeling that it's the leader who says this is what's going to happen, and then everyone does this or doesn't do that. Whereas I think you've identified that the middle manager, the often neglected, often caricatured, the sort of The Office is the classic middle manager, what yes. do they do? Actually, I think you've identified that actually in this change and making it, and maybe making, as you say, making those decisions to speed up the J-curve, the managers you're talking about are not the leaders at the top necessarily. They are the people who are controlling and managing the everyday workflows and organization of parts of the organization and the structure of the organization. So talk a little bit about what this means for the middle manager.
Yes. So, it goes back to that observation that you cannot really specify all the behaviors that you expect of people, especially when you're in a very uncertain and volatile environment. And so you need to leave something to the interpretation of the employees. And so in some ways, I think that the middle managers are really what fills the void between the contingencies that you cannot specify and the action of the employees. Now, this means, it doesn't necessarily mean that all middle managers are good, right? And actually we see in the data, if you dig, that's what's so interesting. Once you have this very rich company level data, you can actually estimate the value added that middle manager bring to the teams that that are under their control. And you can see that there is enormous variation, even within companies. Some middle managers are really bringing a lot of value and others aren't. But, and we also see that if you focus on the middle managers that add value, what do? Well, in one of the papers that I wrote, they motivate people to learn and to get trained. It's a puzzle. Companies spend a ton of money providing training opportunities to their employees. And often the take-up for these training opportunities is very low, and it's very skewed towards the people who already know stuff because they like learning. And so you end up skilling the skilled. And we see that middle managers can actually make a difference in motivating employees to be trained, and that this really makes a difference in turn when there is volatility and the need to cope. In our paper, it's demand shocks. And so I think if you abstract from the specifics that I discussed in our paper, I think this is a time where the middle managers can act locally and communicate, first of all, the overall strategy of the company to the front line. This is a chain of communication that is very hard to feel just through formal announcements or central headquarters announcements. And then in turn, they can also feed information back to the top to signal what's working and what's not working.
It's really interesting. I mean, I think the case study that's going to be on in a few minutes deals with some of those as well, because actually it's got to be, the thing about a manager also is, it seems to be the middle manager, it has to be in the moment, it has to be in the workflow, it has to be about the things that the middle manager is talking to their people about, not about big strategic ideas that you say you put in the office-wide memo. That doesn't so much work. I remember 20 years ago, I was on a stage in Brussels. I think most executives get into this stage where they go on the, I've come off doing that kind of thing many years ago, but I was into that sort of stuff at that stage. And I was on the stage with Brad Smith, who you may know, who's the vice chair at Microsoft, president at Microsoft, and John Monks. And John Monks, people of my age will remember him from the UK. He ran the TUC, the Trade Union Congress. And it was talking about effectively the role of a version of the conversation that we're having now, but 20 years ago when it was more about digital and the internet. And Brad, with his Microsoft hat on, was talking about the kind of disruptive nature of technology, but talking about lifelong learning. And John Monks, the trade unionist, said, my members hated school first time round. So, if you tell them that they're going to spend the rest of their life in school, this is not good news for my members, was John Monks' response. And I think that you reskilling is a real focus of yours, and you've talked about it a little bit there. But how, you've talked about one aspect of that, which is the middle manager and the role that can play. But how does one get, as you say, the people who are natural learners are going to go and learn because that's what they do. But the non-learners, middle managers is one. What else do they need to be thinking about? What else do organizations need to be thinking about in order to reskill?
Look, I think this is a gigantic question, and I would be lying if I told you I have all the solutions to, the World Economic Forum tells us that 1 billion people will need to be reskilled. I don't know how you reskill 1 billion people, but I think it's super important to make sure that we do understand that this is not just a matter of providing opportunities or platforms to employees, or even worse, to people who don't have jobs. Because as you were saying, there is, I think, a strong psychological factor in deciding to learn, and especially learn and reskilling means effectively changing occupation as an adult. And I often use this example because, you know, I'm an applied economist and there are different tribes within economics. If you ask me to become a macroeconomist, I would not be very happy because that's not my tribe. They are wonderful, but it's not my tribe. And so I'm thinking, how are we approaching these reskilling questions? I think we are approaching these reskilling questions from the supply side, like the supply of training opportunities. We really need to put put ourselves in the shoes of who is going, of the people who we want to be reskilled. Professional identity is something that becomes really important. How do we shape the narrative of the new jobs that are going to be available? But how do we make them interesting to individuals who have done something very different with their lives? We did, again, it's possible to do rigorous work on this. We did an experiment with a job center in Italy, working with about 1,100 unemployed people. And, you know, the experiment was sort of trying to get a sense of what's the willingness to pay for reskilling among the unemployed. And it turns out that the identity fit between the individual and the opportunities for which they would have had to reskill was the number one driver of their interest in reskilling. So for organizations, this means you really need to work out the details. Yes, you know, you can craft something at the central headquarters, but who is going to be the messenger of your training programs, and who is going to make that last mile step to make sure that people understand what the opportunity is? And, you know, you have to clarify what are the career consequences of being reskilled, what are the incentives in the long run for making this investment in your human capital. So that's where I see the need for a lot of much more attention and much more work.
I mean, I thought it was interesting in a piece of research you did with a Colombian bank that they had set the principle for of no hiring, no firing during, and that, you know, taking away the fear was one, because if people think that, you know, you have to set, so doing some quite unusual things perhaps in order to create an environment where people are more open to some of the experiments and stuff that you've been talking about. That one really struck me as a really interesting first step for setting the environment for being able to explore and maybe accelerate some of that J-curve.
Yes, I completely agree with you. It starts there. It's not going to be enough. So there is some more work that is not published yet, where, you know, we're actually looking at the implementation of a reskilling program within one company across different plants. And, you know, the central headquarters had one message, and it was along the lines that you described. The local implementation, despite this message, looks quite different. What's the key factor? How quickly people who were reskilled were placed into the new jobs. And what was the friction? Well, locally, the level of trust in the reskilling program was very different. Some people thought that, you know, perfect, you know, I can immediately plug these people back into work, and others were much more skeptical and therefore hesitated to bring these people who had been trained into the workflow. And so if you don't have these things timed, it's a just-in-time production for human capital. You have a window of opportunity. You have to use it when it's ready. And these are things that, again, require clear understanding from the top, a good understanding of who's your partner in the middle, and some quick action, because these are costly investments for employees.
It's very interesting. I mean, perhaps a final topic for us to discuss is, you know, something rightly dear to business school professors, but also I think to most organizations, even though they don't perhaps think about it quite as explicitly as we do in business school, and that is about sustainable competitive advantage. That if you think about what the usual moats are that prevent competitors from getting to, you know, the thing that makes customers buy from us and not from somebody else, so many of those seem to be undermined, if I'm not overly mixing my metaphors, by AI. That you know, if I'm doing things now with AI, what's to stop someone else doing exactly the same thing? If it's no longer a rarity of a an expertise. If it's no longer the fact that my application does this because you could reverse engineer that application with a completely different set of code, many of the things that we consider to be many aspects of scale are now sort of coped with by AI. How should businesses think about how to develop, I guess, but then to maintain sustainable, by which we mean defensible, competitive advantage?
Again, you're asking me all the tough questions, Andrew. All right. So look, I think it's interesting because I'm not sure what your experience is. My experience is that sometimes there isn't clarity about the strategy and what makes the strategy sustainable, even without AI.
Right.
So, we do this exercise of driving your value proposition when we have companies that come over here, which is nothing else but putting yourself in the shoes of your customer and trying to understand what are the attributes of what you do that they really value, from the most important to the least important. And then I've seen you doing it in class, so I know what you're talking about, but just for our listeners, and then trying to compare yourself with their competition. The amount of times that people didn't know what these attributes were, they didn't know how to prioritize them, they had no idea how different they were from the competition. I think that that's the baseline, okay? Now, for companies that have done this work and are at the frontier, I don't know if AI is necessarily something to be seen as fear. I think it's true that it might remove some of the moats for scale advantages, but there are maybe a couple of considerations. The first one is, I see generative AI as creating value within each firm in a different way. So how you use AI will be different from how a different company uses AI. And the bottlenecks, what creates differentiation. And so perhaps we can buy the technology equally in the market, but how we implement it, that's going to be the moat. And that's going to be how we think about differentiation. The second thing is that sometimes AI is a fantastic complement to what we do. Like, I'm an educator, I should be terrified by AI, but I confess I'm also really electrified by what this can do. It can bring what I teach in a way, to the learners in a very individualized and personalized way. I think this is an opportunity, could be a complement. So for these reasons, I think it's good to be paranoid. But I would be paranoid just because there are new firms that are coming up with AI native organizations that don't have all the frictions that we discussed. But if you're a legacy organization and you know what to do with this, I think that we're going to see a massive divergence. That could be actually an advantage to grow even more.
Well, I think that's a very inspiring and kind of forward-looking. It's a kind of a challenge, I guess, to us as business leaders of how to think about Gen AI. And I think that what you've done today, Raffaella, in letting us see that actually we don't have to guess everything. We don't have to, you talk somewhere about avoiding the extremes of that can come from just going on anecdotal information, and the role that actually thinking about data and doing experiments can bring. I'm going to ask, just before we jump off, I'm going to ask Ellie Rashbas and Peter Young to join us. They're going to discuss the case study, which I think will bring to life, if that's the right phrase, some of the things that we've been talking about. So whilst Ellie and Pete join us, I just want to say, Raffaella, thank you so much for coming and sharing your extraordinary insights with us. I learn from you every time we meet, and today has been no different to that. So
thank you for having me.
It's been amazing, really. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.
And with that,
thank you.
Bye, Raffaella. Thank you so much. And Pete, thank you so much for joining us. I think that so many of the things that I know you think about were covered from a different angle by Raffaella, and I'm going to be enjoying from the sidelines the discussion that I know you're now going to have with Ellie. So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Andrew and Raffaella. What a incredible conversation, and so many ideas will definitely stick with me. I'm sure the same for many of our guests with us today as well. And I think just the whole concept of how experimentation is becoming a strategic capability, really something that will differentiate firms from one another, and how almost we all need to become scientists, HR leaders, managers. We need to think in more scientific, experimental ways. What's a hypothesis? What problem are we trying to solve? What are we going to try? Has it actually moved the needle? So I think that's an incredibly exciting time for us to be pushing the boundaries of what we can do. And hearing a couple of other things that really stood out to me. Hearing Professor Raffaella talking about how fundamental culture behaviors are often what could really make one organization different from another is very exciting as well. I mean, I think we're really going to be bringing together these themes today, and actually looking like, well, what does it look like when an organization tries, a real organization with real opportunities, real challenges, brings in AI to solve problems. And I think some of these problems, opportunities will relate very closely to what Raffaella spoke about. And to dive into this, we're very fortunate, delighted to be joined by the amazing Pete Young, who's a very transformational HR director. Many people, especially those dialing in from the UK and those with young families, will know 𝐒𝐜𝐻𝐸, the company 𝐒𝐜𝐻𝐸 Active Play. Will be very close to their hearts, bringing a lot of joy to many families. With the amazing kind of activity centres, growing incredibly quickly. I think now up to 18 different parks around the UK. 1,000+ employees, an incredibly exciting company. Pete herself has been chief HR officer there for 3.5 years and held very senior roles in other leading UK retailers before that. So Pete, we're so delighted to have you with us. To dive into real world examples of your kind of leading use of AI. So Pete, welcome. Please, it'd be great to learn a bit more about yourself and the amazing 𝐒𝐜𝐻𝐸 as well.
Thanks, Ellie, and thank you for having me. I got so caught up in the last half an hour, I completely forgot we were doing this. I was so wrapped up in everything Professor Sadun was saying, so thank you. So I've been with 𝐒𝐻𝐸 now for about 3.5 years. When I joined, we're at 6 parks, and like you say, we're now at 18. And we've grown through both acquisition and opening new sites. And most recently, at the end of last year, we acquired 5 of the 17 Ninja Warrior sites in the UK. So that's where we're at. Our employees are anywhere between 17. I think I'm one of the eldest now, which is a worrying place to be. But yeah, about 1,000 people all in, and most of them frontline in our parks and creating amazing experiences for our customers.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think people always stand out to me, when we speak, is how this kind of dual focus you always have between 𝐒𝐻𝐸 being both the best place to work for all your colleagues, but also the best place for customers and people to come, and thinking about the work you're doing behind the scenes, and the opportunities, challenges that presents is very exciting. So I think if we kind of dive into it, some of the challenges, P, and opportunities that you've been doing an amazing job with that 𝐒𝐻𝐸. I think that there are 3 that really stood out to me, from when we first met. So you've mentioned, Pete, this incredible growth that 𝐒𝐻𝐸 is going both organically and also through M&A, through the acquisition of some of the Ninja parks as well. And I think Professor Raffaella spoke about how important culture is, the behaviors, and I'm sure as you started to scale, especially rapidly, and bringing in colleagues from other backgrounds as well, thinking about how you keep what makes 𝐒𝐻𝐸 special, what makes 𝐒𝐻𝐸 the place everyone wants to work, and also the place where everyone wants to go and visit when there are other choices, and to be the place that wins in the market, I think is a very exciting challenge, and looking forward to diving into that. And the other one is, you mentioned the gap in age. You have colleagues that are both very young and also colleagues, with more experience at different parts of their careers. And I suppose the expectations that come with that, particularly when it comes to technology, the capabilities, people's confidence levels, it is really exciting to dive into as well. And when you think about reskilling different, across multi-generational age gaps, and people really changing the way that they work, especially when most of your colleagues are with customers the whole time, how do you even think about reskilling them to, when they're always kind of busy with customers? So I think those 3 challenges are, number one, how do you keep the culture, how do you keep 𝐒𝐻𝐸 essentially, what makes you special as you grow? Number two, how do you reskill a workforce? How do you help people learn new ways of working when your people are across, multi-generations, and then especially when people are on the front lines? We're really excited to dive into these with you today. So why don't we start with the first one? So I suppose to ask the question, very, very explicitly, as you've grown and acquired, what's been the hardest thing about keeping Oxygen? And as an HR leader, where did you feel the biggest kind of challenge? And then I'm sure we'll come onto the techniques and tools you've used for that.
As Raffaella said, if there's a way of monetizing that, we'd all be very wealthy people. So it is a challenge, and it remains a challenge, but a good one. So for me, coming from a global retailer back into a much smaller business, it was really nice to feel the culture within the business. So at that point, our CEO was very connected to the sites, to the people, as with the senior team. We didn't have an office, so we were using the sites as an office space, and everybody was very well connected. And culture always shows up predominantly, first and foremost, in behaviors. And what I was seeing were people shoulder to shoulder, everybody excited about where the business was going, real care and community for each other, but also this real passion to provide just the best fun for kids, and taking all the stress out of it for parents, whether it was, exercising and playing with their kids for an hour while they could sit and have a cup of coffee, or taking the stress out of birthday parties. There was just this real passion and pride in what people were doing in their day job. When you say, where do you work? A trampoline park? But it's so much more than that. And I think when we're talking about things like sustainable competitive advantage, for us, it's really hard to have a bad time on a trampoline. Like, try jumping up and down and not smiling. So it's kind of an easy win. But what makes us different are our heroes, are the kids, essentially, those 17 to 25-year-olds that are working in trampoline parks, working in our indoor activity centres. And on that wet Tuesday afternoon, or that really busy Saturday when you're on your 400th customer that day, how do you keep your energy levels going? How do you want to make that as good as experience as the one you did this morning when you were full of beans after your breakfast? And it's always going to come back to the company culture. So for me, the first challenge was, how do we code what we're seeing and what we're feeling? And then now that we've coded it and we understand it, how do we protect it as we scale? And that's both making it tangible, which is a really hard thing to do with culture, but also when we are acquiring other businesses, how do we bring in the best parts of their culture and not be like this big overlord that's saying ours is the way to go, but making sure that as we're growing and learning, we're keeping all those core values and those core behaviors at the center of everything that we do.
That's super, Pete, and I know from from knowing you and also from other colleagues how your passion and pride is absolutely at the center of everything that you're doing. And one of the experiments that Pete and the team have been running is, how do we make these amazing values, these behaviors, tangible? So much thought, so much science went into what do we mean when we say we want people to be passionate and to have pride? What does that mean for a manager on their day-to-day? But even once that thought has been done, how do you actually help colleagues to live and breathe these behaviors when they're in the real flow of their day and flow of work? And we're very proud at ScultureAI that one of the experiments that Pete and the team have been running there is piloting ScultureAI. And for those of you who haven't come across ScultureAI before, ScultureAI is specifically encoded with the values and behaviors, the ways of working that matter to Oxygen, that make Oxygen special. And actually, these AI models are then integrated into the flow of work and are supporting colleagues with personalized private nudges when an opportunity comes right now to manager Thomas. This is an opportunity where you can show a bit more passion or have a bit more pride, and for example. So Pete, really keen to, I suppose, hear how your experience has been so far. I suppose what your hypothesis was, what problem you were trying to solve, so we could think scientifically about it, as Raffaella was talking about. And I suppose what you've seen's worked really well, how we've iterated together to help kind of keep that culture, what makes Oxygen the best.
Yeah. So I think what we were trying to do is to give people a tool that they can use day to day. And like you say, we talk about workflow, but it's, you know, in your day, how can you understand what our values are? What are the behaviors that behind that? Am I living, breathing? So lots of places, and there is a place for it. They put things on the walls, they have the mouse mats, they have the toys, etc. But our teams are there on the front line dealing with customers. Our central team's very small, so we do a lot with quite little. So for us, it was about how do we get the coaching delivered in a way that works for people who are 17 to 47. And how do we then make sure it fits into everybody's day without having to have 100 different solutions? And the thing that I particularly liked about ScultureAI when I first learned about it is, yes, it's an AI tool, which we're all getting to grips with, but it's about us. So we're talking about competitive advantage, we're talking about our culture, we're talking about what makes us different to how, not just either other and or activity parks, but with the cost of living the way it is, families are really thinking about how they're spending their disposable income, or how they're spending their time and their money with their children. And it's going to go in lots of different places. We have to be really careful that it's coming with us and then it comes back to us. So all of those things are sort of flying around. And the thing that I really liked about ScultureAI was it solves the problem of it's in real time. So it's as and when it's needed. It's also playing to the advantage of, I think Raffaella was talking about organisational responses to AI, and our uptake's been incredible. And I think that's got a lot to do with the age demographic of the people that was like, yeah, it's AI. I use it every day. It's not a big deal. I'm thinking this is amazing. Like, that's fine. So I think that's been a massive advantage for us. And then I think it's about the fact that even in the short time that we've been, and I'm going to use experimenting and call myself a scientist from now on, I might change my job title because I love this, is the way that the tool itself has developed. So before, when we started, you had to sort of click a button and get some coaching, whereas now it's prompting you, and prompting's massive in AI. It's prompting you to say, well, have you thought about this? Or even a little, when you've done something really well, giving you a little positive nudge. So we've seen it in the pilot so far, which we're just about to extend, that there aren't any downsides to it. And it's absolutely making our culture and behaviour something that people are talking about and thinking about almost every day. Whereas before we were really struggling with, how do we talk about pride? How do we talk about passion? How do we talk about moments of wow and playing together? Where some people are doing it all the time on court, but if you're in the finance team or the people team or you're the CEO, how does that show up in your day to day? So it's probably a bit of a garbled answer, but it's definitely the real-time piece has been a massive win, and also trying to really bridge that gap between how do I appeal to a 17-year-old who's doing this for perhaps 6-7 hours a week, and how do I appeal to somebody who's doing a 40-hour week and is at whatever stage they are in their career. So there's been lots of wins for us.
Oh, that's super, Pia. So great, so great to hear that. And I think, for so many companies, culture remains, just words on the wall. And there's data from MIT where they've shown that the correlation between what companies say their values or behaviors are versus what they actually are on the ground is zero, or sometimes even negative. Because of course, without actually injecting these values and behaviors into the flow of work, into what people are actually doing, you run the risk of, will people even remember? Even if they do remember, do they realize this is an opportunity to show a bit more passion? If they do realize, they actually know how to inject that in. So, and that's all the way from people on the front line to finances, etc. So yeah, fascinating. Thank you for sharing your experience there. I think something that's really interesting to dive into is kind of the M&A side. I used to be an investment banker myself, working in M&A in my old life, and when we used to do our kind of models on Excel, there was no row that kind of looked at the synergies from culture. I reckon that is or will change, but looking back to my old life, that definitely wasn't a line item, which is fascinating, I suppose, considering that culture is the key driver. We heard that very clearly from Raffaella before. So I suppose as you grow, not just organically, but bringing on other companies as well, I think it probably is maybe a final question to end on. I think because it's so relevant, the learnings from here to so many different companies. What have you found some of the opportunities and challenges of bringing together two different cultures, and I suppose trying to take the best from both, but while still staying very true to the heritage of Oxygen?
Well, I think the key is not to rush it. So we acquired the 5 parks in October, so it's still fairly new. And I think the thing that we became apparent very quickly is it's another small organisation, very, very similar characteristics to where Oxygen was 3 years ago. So understanding that and supporting that is definitely been key number one. And then I think it's spending time with people. I'm delighted that the managers in the Ninja Parks are going to have access to the Sculpture tool as well, because I think that's just another way of bridging. It's not a divide, but just bridging that gap between, you know, being a team of 200 to now being a team of 1,000, and how do I communicate with those people? How do they communicate with me? And starting to see some real similarities in some of that written communication, because people are using the tool, I think is going to be a real win for the newer team members kind of integrating with Oxygen. And then I think the key for me and my team will really be to kind of stop, pause, and sort of 3 to 5 months look back and go back to our original values, behaviours, and just have a look. And are they still, I'm sure they will be, but are they still valid? Are they still right? Knowing what we know now and bringing in the ninjas the way that we have, is there anything that we need to add? Anything that we need to update to make sure that we're not staying static in that field? Because as Raffaella was saying, it's still an emerging technology. And I think we need to treat ourselves in the same way, that we're an emerging business, it's an emerging acquisition, and we've got this tool at our disposal now to really be able to help us codify those values and those behaviours, but making sure that we're not, okay, well, we've done that piece of work, now we're done. I think we might need to revisit, and the feedback that we get from the tool, I think, will really help us do that.
That's amazing, Pete. And I think this conversation has flown on so well from the first part, you know, where kind of real business problems, but which, you know, have attached to them, you know, a lot of, if we don't solve this, you know, there's a lot of risk, but also if we do solve it, if we are able to maintain, you know, that incredible culture to help to reskill, bring new ways of working to a frontline workforce across so many generations, you know, what an incredible opportunity. And I think AI, you know, so much talk about AI is about, you know, how can we, you know, replace humans, how can we automate things that are already being done? But actually here is such an amazing example of AI coming in to help everybody be the best version of themselves, to inject pride, inject passion, inject wowness into everything that they're doing. And, you know, at ScultureAI, we've been, you know, very fortunate, and, you know, to be able to work, you know, with Pete and the amazing team at Oxygen to use AI to solve real challenges. And, you know, Raffaella mentioned, you know, for every organization, you know, it's very specific how AI will work for them. And that's the beauty as well, that AI is so flexible that, you know, it could be coded for every company for their ways of working, their behaviors, their values, the communication tools that they use, what it means to different companies. And for example, innovation means different things for compliance teams than it does for, you know, for an R&D team. And I want to, you know, thank Pete for, you know, being an amazing partner, and also for, you know, sharing her learnings, which, you know, are much broader than just Sculpture. So I want to thank everyone for joining. I'm going to bring up on screen, if you can, please, Mac, just to bring up on screen. We're always delighted and welcome the opportunity to continue the conversation. Anyone who has similar challenges or looking to capitalize on similar opportunities with AI, 3 very easy ways to get in touch with the team here. Calendly link in the middle there, the QR code, my direct email, and LinkedIn as well. And, you know, we'd be very excited to continue the conversation about all things AI, all things culture, all things behavior change, particularly if anyone would like to see a demo to learn more about how companies like Oxygen are leveraging AI to solve their real problems, and also able to experiment and to pivot with the tool and to adapt it and adapt the encoding quickly, is incredibly powerful. And almost, you know, to join us on the journey to, you know, to inject more science into culture. So massive thank you again to our 3 other speakers, to Andrew, Raffaella, to Pete, for such a fantastic conversation, and to bring to life, you know, what is often very abstract, both AI and culture, and to show how tangible and real they can be. So massive thank you again to our speakers. Thank you to our audience and listeners as well. And please do join us for future webinars as well. Thank you so much.